Hello, everybody. It is me again. Howie thought he was going to be on, but he's going to be busy with doing things at the European Greens Congress in Ireland right now. So this week, like we've done on other weeks when Howie hasn't been able to be on at the time of the live stream, we're going to air a couple of interviews that he's done in his travels. The first is with Lela, and I'm going to probably butcher this last name, but with Lela Rekhviashvili. And it's about Georgia, the country being caught between Western and Russian imperialism. And it's very timely right now with massive protests going on regarding their recent elections. And then the second one is an interview with Gretchen Dutschke Klotz, who is the widow of Rudi Dutschke, who is known as Red Rudi. He was a leader with the German SDS, which is a youth group of the Social Democrats that broke away in the 1960s, and he was one of the key organizers of the Green Party movement in the 1970s in Germany, which promoted ecosocialism as an alternative to the Western social democracies, regulated capitalism, and the Soviet bloc's authoritarian rule. So we're going to air those two today. Again, Howie thought he would be able to be here, but he's going to be too busy at the conference to be able to actually get on at the time that we stream. He will be back in the United States next week, so I expect everything will be back to normal in terms of the show once he returns. So enjoy these interviews. Have a good weekend, everybody, and we will see you back next week when Howie's back in the country.
Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I'm here with Lela Rekhviashvili, who is a Georgian activist and academic. She's a political geographer, and she has studied the Georgian economy, the recent movements against the Russian law and the elections. So, Lela, why don't we start with your assessment of the elections? What people hoped they would achieve, and what happened, and what's going on now in Georgia.
Just to clarify, I have not done research on either the mobilizations against the Russian law nor on the elections themselves. I have done research in Georgia on various social movements, most prominently on the movement of the Oni Valley movement against Namakani hydropower plant. But also some others. I can briefly say about the elections that what we see is a very disappointing and very disillusioning situation in Georgian context, where the opposition or anyone who observed this has really seen very documented and very obvious instances and very generalized instances of falsification of the elections. We have also already seen how the courts have basically refused to take the evidence for the rigging of elections. So the situation is pretty desperate in the sense that it's clear that at this point state institutions, including court, are too weak to engage with, not too weak, but too subordinated to the power hierarchy to engage with it, to seek justice. Which essentially is, and I don't mean to say Georgian Dream Party, the ruling party, also has certain support base, right? This is what some of the leftists would contest and say they actually are supported. Yes, they actually are supported, but they also, as well, stole voices of many people and falsified voices of many people. We don't need to declare opposition victorious to still be met at the very obvious and very systematic stealing of people's voices. The other sad aspect of this, in all honesty, from my perspective, is that the way opposition has worked against very devastating processes of authoritarian consolidation in Georgia that we see now with the elections very clearly, but we also have been seeing in the past years through enhanced repressions of various movements, including Namapani movement, but also others, and through adoption of the two laws, so-called foreign agent law and LGBT propaganda law, but these are also these are the aspects of authoritarian consolidation that have been very publicly contested and very visible to also international audiences. But there have been other processes as well within Georgian context, like really attempts to subordinate civil society, cultural sphere, academia have started already 2 years ago. And these processes were deepening and spiraling. So in this sense, huge demonstrations that followed first in 2023 and then in 2024, particularly the adoption to foreign agent law, are not surprising. They're very understandable, because for many it was understandable that this law is really one more and a very powerful step in pressing the authoritarian power. What, on the other hand, I find very sad in this political situation is the discursive and political choices of those that stand in opposition to authoritarian consolidation in Georgian context. That is, Georgian opposition and quite a bit of civil society organizations. And when I say this, I don't mean that I don't support the struggle. When I'm in Georgia, I go to demonstrations, and if I was there, I would go again. But I do think that they have done a terrifying mistake by reducing everything about this ongoing struggle just to Russia-Europe choice and Russia-Europe cleavage. And while there might be a layer of this cleavage, it is also quite an insufficient layer to articulate problems that Georgian society faces, right? But also to articulate even geopolitical situation that Georgia now finds itself in, right? Even for that, Russia-West or Russia-Europe discourse is too thin. Particularly to say from a leftist perspective, because I mean the forces that are now fighting against authoritarianism, or as they call it, against Russia's occupation or Russia's influence in Georgia, those forces are not leftist forces. They're very far from leftist forces, right? But they also, at this point, have the power. I mean, in general, the Georgian left is not big or strong, but they also subordinate those voices from the left, and at least for me, as one of the leftist characters in this political scene, I must say that leftist positions can never collapse into this West versus Russia dichotomy, not in Georgian context and not in any context. And one of the reasons for this, I've been thinking on this, one of the reasons for this is that if you glorify the West and deproblematize the West in a peripheral country like Georgia, so Georgia, I still think maybe the situation will be changing. Maybe Georgia will be becoming more Russia's periphery or China's periphery. But currently Georgia, if it's something's periphery, Georgia is Europe's periphery. And it has been primarily the US and EU that have imposed brutal and dispossessing neoliberal policies on this country. So by obscuring this and by saying that if we come to Europe, all of our sorrows will be cured and we will be protected from Russia, you obscure the space to problematize what has led Georgian society to the type of inequalities, to the type of dispossessions that this country suffers, or most of its population suffers. And let me make it very then clear, right? So to make the example out, let me just tell a bit more story about the protests. So last spring, in spring 2024, there were huge, like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands person mobilizations in the capital against the foreign agent law. Now, after elections in October, there have been also huge demonstrations against rigged elections. Now, in between, there were populations affected by manganese mining from the village called Shukruti that at this point have been on a permanent protesting against the I don't know if you ever have come across against the unbelievable direct devastation of their living environments. And they have been asking, so they have been out for now I think up to 300 days, protesting in tents, and they're asking just for decent compensation for the loss of their entire livelihoods, their living spaces, their land plots, their houses. And these crowds, in the middle of the summer, also came to the capital city to protest. They occupied the very same space that the protests against this Russian law were occupying. They of course got some degree of solidarity, but absolutely minor, because with this current political scene, and with this story that either you are pro-European or you're pro-Russian, and now you have to choose, and you cannot talk of Europe in any complex ways or of the West in any complex ways, because that means that you're a traitor. People go saying really terrifying insults, right, on each other. People call out those that supported Georgian Dream as Red Army, right? So you are a traitor if you make any slightly more complex arguments about the role of the West in Georgia's politics than saying Europe will save our SDs from everything. But the point is that this type of positioning has obscured any space for any of this opposition to articulate what's the injustice that the people from Shukruti are struggling with. So if you don't say that this is the privatization of resources that followed Rose Revolution, that was engineered by local political elites as well as really US. The US has been super active in this. USAID, in collaboration with World Bank, after the Rose Revolution, that is in early 2000s, have been absolutely crucial in shaping neoliberal policies in Georgia. And then later, when EU became more active in Georgian context, EU has carried this further, right? So if you obscure space to name this as injustice and to name the role of the West in producing this type of injustice, in entirely incapacitating the state to, on very basic level, discipline the private companies that have taken over various mining sites. If you can't say that, then you can't find solidarity, of course, with Shukrutian protesters. And in this way, you essentially can't find solidarity with most of Georgia's workers, with most of Georgia's populations that have been affected by commodification of nature. And this, I think, is at heart, of the sad situation in Georgian context, where the opposition is unable to articulate most of population's pain, and Europe will save us is not saving the opposition cause.
Yeah, I was able to talk with the leaders of the Shukruti mining disaster and also the people fighting that mega dam, which I know you studied. And talking to people with the mega dam, they said, right now it's the U.S. Embassy trying to find new investors to support the Georgia Greens plans to get that dam built, even though the U.S. has also got some sanctions on the leadership of the Georgia Greens. And they were looking for some way we could pressure the U.S. government to stop pushing this dam, which this movement paused the development of by scaring away the previous investors. And now the U.S. is talking out of one side of its mouth against authoritarian Georgia Dream, and the other side of its mouth trying to do business with it.
Yes, this is the next, and you're bringing up the case. Howie, can we have a slight break? We're good?
We're good.
So what I was trying to tell is that Namohani movement or the Rioni Valley movement is one of the examples where you cannot, like the current opposition, for example, will not be able to solidarize with this movement. And one of the reasons is precisely their bland focus on geopolitics, but a specific way of looking at geopolitics only in the Russia versus West dichotomy. And they won't care, like Namohani movement will be one of the movements that the current opposition won't care about fundamentally. And the story of Namohani, not just the movement but also the hydropower development sector, is also very telling in terms of Europe's role in shaping up Georgia's development politics. So I don't know, I must say, of either Georgian government trying to find a new investor that would be related to the US, or the US trying to find a way to invest either in Namohani hydropower plant or any other hydropower plant. So the US story so far, honestly, for me is not... maybe I'm missing information, but from all the information that I have, US involvement is not there in this particular project. What is there, however, is immense role that the European Union has played in general promoting hydropower as the developmental heyday in Georgia and reinforcing it recently by approving Black Sea underwater transmission cable. I don't know if you've heard of this. This is a huge project essentially that is supposed to connect Azerbaijan through Georgia to Romania and Hungary. So the end station, Hungary, as you know, is playing an increasingly important role in Europe's green transitions, as they are hosting some of the largest Chinese plants for electric battery production. And this underwater cable is basically talked of as enabling the so-called green energy corridor through from Azerbaijan to Europe. Besides the fact that we don't know how green this will be, it also, in Georgian context, has undermined all the labor that anti-dam movements, not just Namohani, but also other movements against other huge power plants, particularly in Svanetia, but also elsewhere in Georgia's mountainous regions that have been past decades so much resistance, especially against huge or big hydropower plants. And with Namohani, it really seemed in 2021 that not only did the government need to step back, but even the biggest supporters of these types of development or of the hydropower, that is European banks like European Investment Bank, EIB, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, they're usually typical investors in such things. They also started talking that Georgia should look at other renewables and not be stuck so much with hydropower. So it really seemed that all the buildup of the resistance had slightly at least altered altered the positions about the sector. And this was reversed once the EU started supporting the underwater cable, because the underwater cable is supposed to carry electricity. Georgian government wants to be able to produce extra electricity for export. What happened since is that Georgian government has restarted talking about attracting investment in all the big contested hydropower plants, but they also, of course, are continuing building of small power plants. Like these are hundreds of power plants. Okay, by 2024, there were 214 memoranda already signed. I mean, 214 hydropower plants. Georgia is a very small country. There is a hydropower plant essentially on all major rivers, either already built or a couple of them already built or planned. And now they have made up lists of next 200 that basically relist again all the previously cancelled projects. So yes, I mean, in this sense, I sometimes tend to say that honestly, if Europe would want to get what they want to get from Georgia, that is energy transit or extra energy production, then I don't think any Georgian government can do it in a democratic way. That's just not the... Georgian people have over and over mobilized against this type of development in the past decade. If this is something that is still being pursued, that can only be done in authoritarian ways. So in this sense, what I mean to say is that we don't just need Europe, we need Europe to fundamentally rethink what kind of development politics it pursues in its peripheries. And the type of development politics that Europe pursues in its peripheries, and this is not just Georgia, right? We also see what Europe has done now, or what the European Union has been now doing to Serbia, or other basically peripheral countries around it. They're desperate for energy, and they're willing, or more broadly, this kind of green transitions agenda. They're desperate for energy in particular, and they are willing to support a lot of very problematic ways of implementing energy infrastructure projects and other projects that support green transitions like lithium mining. So we do have, and like hiding this from our side, I think, doesn't help oppositional thinking or movements at all. So that's the way my challenge is, right? And the point is to come back a bit to what you were saying, right? That actually, I do think that it would be better for Georgia if Georgia could continue integrating with Europe, with the hope that Europe then would also take some responsibilities. Because currently what Europe does is liberalize trade, impose regulations, and not be responsible on any costs of this, any social costs of this. I don't know, like I don't think these mechanisms are great even for within Europe, but they at least have within Europe certain mechanisms to compensate for the harm and compensate for the loss of various economic processes that they're pushing now on the peripheral countries. I don't know, for example, there is a Just Transitions Fund, right, that would support peripheralized regions that are going through transitions or losing out because of their transitions, etc., etc. These are all the resources that are not available for non-member or not even like candidate countries like Georgia. So in a certain way, maybe EU integration would be better than the situation that we have now. But I honestly do think that this should also be then clear statement that maybe integration is better because it would reduce the harm that is imposed by the EU, and not that we need integration because integration will save us. And EU has been always the kind actor on us, or West has been so nice on us, and now we need to keep being with them. So yeah, I would support EU integration in pragmatic senses, but not for the reasons what the Georgian opposition currently proposes. But importantly, and I think this is a huge risk, I do think that currently for European Union this is very beneficial position, because they can indeed blame everything on Georgian government, but they most likely, both EU and US, will continue working together with the Georgian authoritarian government. And this is a gigantic risk and very plausible scenario too. They will continue working on these various projects, essentially without leaving Georgian society any mechanisms of engaging with the development politics that they are making up together with the Georgian elites. And there is this energy direction, right? And there I think it's clear that the EU will not want to stop severe relations with Georgian government, even if it goes authoritarian. And it did go authoritarian at this point, right? I mean, they ultimately falsified elections. And there is also this kind of transit role that Georgia has. And this is more precarious, let's say, story. It is precarious because of lack of clarity on what positions EU will be taking in relation to China. So, while Georgia is currently working through this energy corridor role, it also simultaneously is working through the transport hub and corridor role. And the transport hub would be connecting Europe and China. This is again much like energy, caused by Russia's aggression on Ukraine and inability of the trade routes through Russia to work in the past years, and reactivation of what they call middle corridor as one of the alternative routes. So far there is a big risk that EU just will want to work this corridor and be connected to China. And also this way reinforce and support authoritarian government in Georgia. But this is something that we don't know so well, because I think depending on how US politics plays out in relation to China and how confrontational that gets, what Europe will choose, because Europe has been very undecided about their relationship with China. I think they have started to be more and more cautious, but there is quite a lot of industries that are interested in continued trade, also continued investments in China, continued investments from China. So I think this is more, say, precarious and unclear in this current situation, part of the story, but it's also there as one of the underlying stories. And yes, I think normalization of Georgia as an authoritarian state that plays into the hands of all supposedly rival but ultimately well collaborating imperial powers is, I think, a big risk.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about, and the left has to have its own alternative. We can't choose between one imperial bloc or the other. And Georgia faces that like many other smaller countries and those of us in the bigger powers. So I think we'll stop there. You gave us plenty to think about, and I appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm trying to stop it. Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins, and I'm here with Gretchen Dutschke Klotz, who We worked together in the early American Green movement in the 1980s and early 90s, and she is the widow of Rudi Dutschke, Red Rudi, a famous activist from the German New Left, who was a key figure in developing the German Green Party by the late 1970s. So I'm going to ask Gretchen, just tell us about Rudi and, how he developed politically in the 60s and into the 70s.
Well, in the 60s was a little different. So do you want me to start already in the 60s or should I go in the 70s?
Oh, start in the 60s. I think that's, history that American Greens ought to know about.
Okay.
Our roots in the New Left. Some people don't realize that.
Yeah. So in the 60s, of course, we didn't have the ecological question. The question was really a political question. And what the situation in Germany was such that the German people, they had a constitution. It was a so-called democracy. But if you looked at the people, what they believed, it turned out that 7% of the people in Germany believed in democracy. All the rest believed in fascism, or they wanted the king back again. That was it. So when the movement started at the beginning of in the early 60s, they had to struggle against a whole population who wanted something totally different. However, it began to work slowly. It was very slow at the beginning, but slowly people were thinking, well, maybe they're right, maybe this is right. And things happened, like the police put people in jail. Like one time, it was at Christmas time, there was a fantastic demonstration where a Christmas tree was burnt down. People were singing the International and stuff like that. And people were getting put in jail because the police didn't know who was actually in the demonstration. It was all together because it was Christmas time. So all these people, I was in the jail too, and these people were asking, what's going on here? And then I said, well, actually, it's a demonstration against Vietnam. And they were totally surprised. But anyway, I had happened to have some wine because that was part of the demonstration. So I said, well, we can take this wine that I happened to bring with me. And they thought it was so funny. So they were all kind of happy. And so people would change their mind, I think. Rudi's viewpoint at that time was, see if we can go in the SPD, we'll try it. And gradually he came to the point where you should split the SPD because it was too conservative.
And let me just tell people, the SPD is Social Democratic Party of Germany. So it's the reformist Socialist Party, and really the biggest workers' party in Europe going back to the late 1800s.
Yeah. So he wanted to form a USPD, an independent social democratic party. And that belief he carried on through the early 70s. He also, at the beginning, was opposed to going into parliament. Later he changed, and that was still in the 60s when he started saying it was in the 70s, I think, where he started talking about the long march through the institutions.
Yeah, that's his most famous statement, I think, that people in America might remember. But he was a leader in German SDS, which was the youth group of the SPD, as opposed to our Students for a Democratic Society. But a lot of SDSers in America were following Rudi in Germany.
Yeah. So the SDS was originally part of the SPD. They had already split off very early, I think, in the 60s. They were by the time Rudi was in it, it was already split off, and they were independent. And the SPD had actually thought they're going to collapse when they're not part of us anymore. But they didn't collapse, on the contrary. Then Rudi joined it, and he brought lots of people into it as well. So the SDS grew very fast, and with the SDS in the USA, we had a lot of connections. So, yeah, let's see. So then, yeah, then came the attentat, so Rudi was pretty much out of the picture. He had to have his operations, several operations go in the hospital. He was very badly damaged.
Yeah, he was a Nazi, tried to assassinate him.
Yeah.
Got shot in the head and the shoulder. The Nazi did it a week after Martin Luther King was assassinated, inspired by that assassination. And so, Rudi was out of commission for a while.
Yeah. So then we went to Denmark because the problem was that there were hundreds of people who wanted to kill us. They were sorry they hadn't killed Rudi, and now they were going to try again and that sort of thing. And Rudi, of course, was very sick, and he couldn't defend himself. He couldn't really do much of anything. So we thought the best thing to do is go to another country. So we went to Denmark. In Denmark, I got a job working at the Food Institute, the Hygiene Institute. And there we had to deal with growing food, especially. And because of this, I became interested in the whole ecological question. I remember my professor asked one day, do you know who Haeckel is? Not Hegel, but Haeckel. And I said no. And then he said, well, actually, he lived at the same time as Marx, and there was actually some correspondence between them. Haeckel was the man who invented the whole idea, the whole word ecological. Anyway, I began studying this, and I read the things from the Club of Rome, and I was really very impressed by it. It just showed really how awful things could be. Actually, since then, it's much worse than it was. Their prediction of what it's going to be now is not as bad as it actually is. But anyway, I told Rudi he should look at this because it's really interesting. Maybe this is the question that he should deal with, because at that point he hadn't dealt with it at all. And then at the same time, it came the demonstration against the nuclear power plant in Vue, and so Rudi decided to go to it, see what was the matter there. He saw the demonstration. These
That's, I think we call that VO, WYHL.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's yeah. Anyway, he went there, and then afterwards, when he gave a speech, he talked once again about splitting the SPD into the USPD, and the people there said, "We're not interested in that." Most of them were farmers. It was in the country, or in a small town. This atomic power work was in a small town. So they were mostly farmers, and they weren't really interested in that at all, but they were interested in this atomic power plant. So Rudi went back and he said, why did they say that to me? Maybe they're right. So he went back and rethought it, kind of like, and then he said, okay, I'm going to call them up in the town where it was, or near the town, and tell them I want to come back. I want to come incognito. I don't want those people to know who I am. I just want to hear what they have to say. So he went there and he listened. And a couple of them did recognize him, but actually most of them didn't. And he was very impressed by it. Then he said, okay, maybe this is right. Maybe this is what we should be concentrated on. And I think that was probably the beginning of the whole ecological problem. And he got eventually to the point where he said, if we let our world be destroyed, we won't be able to have any socialism anyway. So we need to do this. And then he also had a friend at that time, or got a friend, who also was very interested in it, from Czechoslovakia. At that time it was Czechoslovakia, who had left after the revolution, after Dubček's revolution there. So he brought Rudi to all the meetings of the Greens, or at that time it wasn't the Greens, but it was different sort of local groups of green people. And Rudi,
let me just mention a couple of things, because you mentioned a couple of things of how that influenced us. I happen to know the authors of the Club of Rome report, the Dennis and Dana Meadows. In fact, I moved their furniture from Cambridge, Massachusetts up to Dartmouth College in 1972 in the fall. And so I knew them and I knew that report. And then a few years later, the occupation of the nuclear power site at Wiel, or how do you pronounce it in German?
I don't know.
Okay. That inspired us to organize the Clamshell Alliance, and we occupied the Seabrook nuclear power plant site, trying to duplicate the occupation that they did here in Germany, where they took the site over and held it for a long time.
They held it. It's never been built.
Yeah, okay. Well, we didn't succeed in that, but 1,414 of us were arrested, put in National Guard armories for 10 days. We were headlines in all the media for that period, and the anti-nuclear movement exploded across the U.S. as a result. And then some of us who founded or co-founded the Clamshell Alliance were at the first meeting of the first Green Party organizing meeting here in the United States. So just to put this in context and underscore how movements we're dealing with a global capitalist system, and our movements need to be international, and in fact have been. We've influenced each other. So that's just a little context, but you were getting to the point where they were starting to have meetings about organizing a Green Party in Germany.
Yeah. So that was, Vu was, I think, 74, 75 when he started going to the various meetings with his friend who drove him. And I think in 76, he said that he was going to go to, he was giving up the idea of the USPD and saying what we need to do is have a Green Party who's going to deal with the environment, because if the environment is kaput, we can't have socialism, basically. That was kind of his argument. So, so then the meetings, then they started running in local parliaments, and also I think around 76. And in local parliaments, you only needed 1% to get in. So people started coming in. They didn't get 5% as they needed for the national parliament, but they did need the 1%. They got that in many places. So the first Greens were coming into the parliament, in the various states, I guess you'd call it.
Like city councils in the U.S.
No, they weren't city, the states.
Oh, the state parliaments, so the state legislatures.
Yeah, some cities. Berlin is a city, Bremen is a city, but the others are states. Anyway, so they were in some places, and then they said, we have to start a Green Party. Eventually, they came to that conclusion. That was 79. And that's when they decided to have a meeting. Rudy would be one of the people who was delegated to that meeting of the Greens. And it was in 1980, at the beginning of 1980, and Rudy died. So it was very surprising. He wasn't really sick, although, of course, we knew that his brain was badly damaged, but you couldn't tell. By that time, he had recovered so much that everything seemed normal, perfectly normal, and his viewpoints were very... Some of the people that he was working with at that time, the Greens were very mixed. There were people there who were Blutenboden, how do you say that? Blood and earth people.
Blood and soil.
Blood and soil people. And Rudy said, well, we can't, a lot of people said we can't go to the Greens because they're blood and soil people in it. Rudy said, well, first of all, they're a minority, and second, maybe you can convince them any way you can see. And if we have more people than they do, then we'll be able to determine
and blood and soil comes from the Nazi movement and their sort of environmental orientation.
Yeah.
You know, it's Aryan blood in German soil.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there were conservatives coming into this ecology movement.
They were there from the beginning, actually. And so that's also why people were very skeptical of the Greens in the beginning. But there were also others. There were from the CDU people, the conservatives were also in there because they said, we're conservatives, we believe in conservation. It was like together. And Rudi said, well, we have these different groups in the Greens. That's true. But we still have to try and see if we can get the majority. Because if they get the majority, then forget it. But I think we can get the majority. And the people from Bremen, that was Bremen. There was going to be an election in Bremen, and it was a big election where they needed 5% to get in. And they said, if we can get in Bremen, then we have a chance. And they were people from the left. They weren't these right-wing people. So they came to Rudi and they said, can you come to Bremen and try to convince these people? And there were also a number of different kinds of green type groups. Some of them had come from the, maybe I should talk. There was a terrorist group, of course. One knew that. You knew that that these people existed. Rudi was opposed to that from the beginning. He said from the beginning, that's ridiculous to do terrorism now in Germany because we don't have a Hitler. We don't have a situation where Hitler is a danger, and we have to convince people. Basically, our job is to convince people. And the only way we can do it is to talk to them. And we can't do that from the underground. So he was opposed to the people who went to terrorism and to the underground. But maybe even more important than that were these people who were in the sectarian groups. That was the groups that supported Maoism and Stalinism, even Stalinism and Leninism and Trotskyism. And they supported different sectarian groups. And so all of these groups had started about in 1969, 70 or so. By that time, it was 79, so they had existed for about 10 years, and they were kind of losing their power. And people didn't like them really, except for the people who were in them. So Rudi said, or what these people said is, you've got to convince these people, especially the ones who are already interested in environment. You've got to convince them to come to the Greens and leave these sectarian groups. And so Rudi said, okay, I'll do it. And he went to Bremen. He told about the Greens, and he said, if everybody comes to the Greens when we have this election, which is soon, and if we win, we will have the majority. We will, these other groups will be the minority, and they won't mean anything anymore. So he went there. They had the election and won. They got the 5%. They came in the parliament, and that was, of course, for Rudi a success. And after that, that's when they said they should have a real party. I mean, an official party in the whole German parliament. And Rudi was elected to go to that original meeting, which he, of course, as I said, he couldn't go because he had died. What else?
Well, before we started the recording, we were talking about the importance for Rudi of democracy in the socialist vision. And you guys talked to old socialists from the 1920s. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Especially in the 60s, a lot of these people who had been alive then in the 20s were still alive. They were quite old then, most of them in their 80s. But they were still somewhere. And so Rudi decided he was going to find them. And he found quite a few of them, actually, in different countries. We went to Hungary and saw Lukács, and we saw different ones in Austria and different places. And what Rudi found from these people who had been there and had taken part in the Weimar Republic and were in the Communist Party at that time. They said our mistake at that time was that we basically forgot democracy. And that's what we should have done. We should have concentrated much more on getting democracy into our idea of socialism. So, yeah, it was kind of a lesson, you know. Do you have to have democracy in order to have socialism? Yeah, you need democracy and socialism. But what happens when you get democracy and no socialism? That's what happened actually in Germany. Okay, Germany finally did get democracy. And I think, you know, I said at the beginning that there were 7% of the population in Germany that were for democracy. In the beginning, after the Second World War, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 85%.
I mean, 21st century.
The 21st century.
Yeah.
They went from 7 to 85%. That was quite a few. And that included the people in the East. They said they were for democracy. What happened now is another question. But at that time, they thought they were for democracy, but I think they didn't know what it was, because in the East, they never had a democracy movement. That was the problem. So, okay, democracy sounds great. We'll get the D-mark. They thought it was the D-mark, I think. Okay? But anyway, in the meantime, the number of people who want democracy in Germany has gone down quite a lot. It's not 85 anymore. It's under 80. I don't know what it is at the moment, but it's going down, which is very bad. Yeah.
Well, you know, what I take away from that is the new left that, you know, Rudi was such an exemplary figure of, rejected both Western capitalism, which had a facade of democracy, but still the oligarchs really run things. And then in the Eastern so-called socialist bloc, you had one-party bureaucracies running things from the top down. And, you know, it really wasn't socialism in the sense that Marx and the original socialists talked about it, which was, as in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels said, you know, we have to win the battle for democracy. And the workers' movement was what, you know, extended the franchise in Europe. And I think, you know, what Rudi found out talking to the socialists, you know, who went through the World War II and Weimar Republic period, they lost that. And I think that, you know, what that opened also was, you know, the role that Stalinism played, because the Soviet Union became like, oh, if that's socialism, we got to defend it, but it wasn't democratic. And it took until the new left started developing in the 50s and then the 60s to come back to that democratic vision of socialism. And I think that's it's so important, you know, for us going forward, given you alluded to the rise of the far right in Germany, and it's not only Germany, it's a lot of countries, including the United States. Yeah. And so the battle for democracy is essential. With democratic rights, we can fight for socialism. Without democratic rights, we're in a much tougher position.
Yeah, yeah. So basically that was Rudi's position. He did study the situation with Stalin and with Lenin. He thought, at the beginning, he had thought that Lenin had done what he could do as far as getting socialism established in Russia, but at the end he decided that even Lenin had laid the groundwork for Stalin, so that that Stalin could win. And he certainly got the power. He turned the country completely into an authoritarian and very destructive country, which many people were killed. But yeah, so he didn't. So of course that's not what he wanted. I mean, and then you come to the problem. Well, what is it that you do want? And that, I think, is where the problem came with our movement. In the end, you had to say, well, what do we want? what kind of an economic system do we want? Do we want one where everything belongs to the state, where the state has control of all the corporations and things like that, or something else? And I think we haven't really found the answer yet.
Well, I would argue that drawing on the socialist tradition and the anarchist tradition, in the broad socialist tradition of federal structures, confederation from the bottom up. So local communities control the local administration of enterprises, and then they have representation as you go up to larger scales. I think in the United States, we've, I think, written good models for that. Healthcare, the National Health Service, Ron Dellum's bill, was written by people coming out of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. That was very democratic, bottom up. A parallel model was developed for democratic public ownership of the energy system, coming out of the energy crises in 1974 and in 1979. So I would argue we got models that are around to begin, advocating for it. So anyway, I'm a little more optimistic that we've got at least some good models to build upon, and this comes out of that ferment of the '60s and early '70s.
Yeah.
So, you were involved in the Greens and the development in the United States in the '80s, and then you've been back here watching it in Germany. Do you have any thoughts about how the movement has developed? Has it strayed from the kind of vision that Rudi Dutschke had? What are its prospects in your view?
I think the problem was and is with the Green movement in Germany is that they went into parliament, and when you go into parliament, you have to make compromises. It's just necessary if you're going to function there. And with so many years of making compromises, they've gotten further and further away from what the original ideas were. They still want the environment. Okay, they want to save the environment, but what they're doing is helping it a little, but not enough. And the destruction that's being done is still greater than the amount that they're helping it. So it's still getting worse. So how can you do it? And the thing is that this Green Party that we've had up till now, and I think they probably won't get in again because, part of it is because the other parties are telling lies about them. So you don't know exactly what the truth is. But I think that they haven't, it sounds to people like they're not doing anything for the people. They're just like telling people, oh, you have to buy a warm pump. And people don't even know what a warm pump is, but they think, I can't buy a warm pump. And that's what they think. They don't think of, how can I save the environment? It doesn't go from this one thing to something else. And so they think, well, what we really want is good schools, maybe. Okay, that's right, you've got to get good schools. But you can't do it if you're concentrating on all this other stuff. And of course, we've had the war. We've had we've had Ukraine. We've had Syria. We've had all these different wars. We've had, and now we have Israel. And then we had the COVID, and it just messed things up. And I think the problem began with COVID, that people started not trusting the government. A lot of people thought it wasn't right that everybody had to be separated from everybody else. And some of the things were really ridiculous. Here in front of our house, you weren't allowed to go in the playground, which is right next to a big area that's open. So you could be in the open area. So it was packed full of people. but it was forbidden to go right next door into the playground, which was totally empty, which was completely absurd. I mean, there were so many things like that, which made people very angry, I think. Okay, but that began this feeling of the government is stupid, they don't do anything for us, and then they started not trusting the government, and then started this whole, especially in the East, this party, this right-wing party, the AfD, which is a Nazi party, and that's what we have now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like the Trump party. You know, they tell ordinary people your problems are being caused by immigrants and the damn Greens and their climate actions.
Yeah.
You know, and Trump will say, you know, climate change is a hoax, a Chinese hoax or whatever. And in the absence of, I would say in the United States, you know, the Democratic Party providing a real alternative that working people and people having troubles could see was on their side, people then begin to buy these explanations where immigrants and climate action and other, you know, minorities are scapegoats. And that, it's not a real analysis of the problems, but people accept them. And so the right grows. And it's happened in the U.S., it's happening here in Germany.
Yeah.
And I think, well, you've posed the problem, I think, here at the end, you know, how do we fight for, you know, the environmental and climate actions we need in a way that people see that it's in their interests. You know, you talk about the lies, like they'll say the Greens are mandating people get these heat pumps, but they're not. They're saying we should have a public policy to promote heat pumps, which is very different.
Yeah.
And that public policy could provide public funding to get the heat pump installed, and then it gets paid back over time by savings on the utility bills, which is what we're actually fighting for in New York right now.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
I think, you know, this would be good, unless you got anything more you want to tell American Greens and people in the United States. Any other thoughts?
Let's see. Maybe not. Have to think a little bit. So you think I've covered everything? I don't know.
I think we got, you know, a good idea of who Rudi Dutschke was and how the Green movement developed and its roots in the New Left and the problems that threw up and how the ecology question came forward.
Yeah.
And you brought it to Rudi based on your, you know, reading the Club of Rome reports and studying, you know, food production. So there's a lot there for people to think about and see how we got to where we are now in the Green movement. So, and you left us with some problems we got to solve. So that's maybe maybe the next step. So, well,
The
it's been
first problem we have to solve is to get rid of this right-wing mess and get back to the idea of democracy so we have it. And then we can go to the next step of when are we going to get rid of them? And they want to try to get rid of them. So there are some groups that are trying to make it forbidden. The Constitution does allow it to be done because they are destroying democracy. And that's what the Constitution says. If a party wants to destroy democracy, you can get rid of it.
Yeah, and the American Constitution, 14th Amendment said insurrectionists can't run for federal office. And some states' attorney general tried to bar Trump from running again after he tried to overturn the 2020 election. And they didn't succeed in the courts. So it's one thing to have a written constitution, like the old Soviet Union had a lot of good rights written into their constitution. But you need more than just the piece of paper. You need a culture, a democratic political culture that will follow through on those things.
Yeah. And who chooses the judges? I mean, in Germany, I think the judges are, at the moment, probably chosen by the middle rather than right or left. But, you know, you don't know how long that'll last either.
Yeah, and that's what authoritarians do. They get the judiciary.
Yeah.
You know, Orban in Hungary, Netanyahu's trying to do it in Israel. The Republicans have been doing it in the United States for a few decades. So it's another part of the struggle for democracy we got to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Well, it's been, great having caught up with you in Berlin after all these years and talking about, Rudi Dutschke and, his contribution to what became the Green Party movement. And so thanks very much.
Yeah.